Firstly, I guess it's just congratulations about the report. I mean, reading it, firstly I was just struck by how accessible information is and how I was able to sort of just, really sort of connect with what we've said. And the measures, again, really, struck me as important and necessary. I've always sort of held that sense that how do we measure effectiveness, and was really quite considered. And I love that the measure of space for action. That one. Could you sort of talk a little bit about how it came about?
Well, we did this project in Col Westmoreland tonight, and the place that we started from was that the measures of success that have been used to date don't reflect how women and children live in a domestic violence household. They're all focused on physical violence, violence that's reported to the police, and not about the everyday, what women say is walking on eggshells. So we began by interviewing women whose partners were on programmes, the men themselves, the facilitators and funders about what their measures of success were. And interestingly, the women, the stopping violence and abuse was third on their list of priorities. What came first was respect and communication. Being able to just have an ordinary argument, as one woman put it. And then next was this idea that their choices were not so constrained by the context. And the more I think about it, the more I think that this is what Evan Stark means when he says we shouldn't just be concerned about women's safety, we should be concerned about their freedom. And so I see that measure as being about women's freedom. Actually, both of them are. The first one is the freedom to have a voice and an opinion. And the second one is the freedom to make choices and be in control of your life and your body. So those became the most important measures for us to find a way to explore them with women and men in the project. And that's part of our contribution in terms of methodology, I think, to say these are what we should be looking at, as well as the ending the physical violence and threats.
I love the stark coercive control inclusive micro-regulation of gender, which when censored to failing to perform a man's expectation of proper femininity. I think that again sort of captures that micromanagement about every little aspect. That is again, hard to mention, to find when we're talking about the overt or the more obvious and evident aspects of living a tense and controlled relationship. I think that's a great word.
And part of what we're trying to say is that violence is doing gender. That it's not just about structural inequality. It's actually about how the men are men in that relationship. And that in using violence, they're actually trying to craft her into a way of being a woman that is acceptable to him. And it's the fact that she resists, the fact that she contests, that then you get the physical violence. So it's also a challenge to this way of how we think about victimisation, that somehow victimisation is all about passivity. But actually they're contesting gender in the relationship. And I don't think we often get that clarity in some of the ways that men's behaviour change is thought about. That actually, if they are going to change, they have to change their way of being a man. And they have to change their expectations of what being a woman is, and of what being a child is, actually, because we also look at their parenting. And that's what we're changing. It's not just about behaviour. It's actually about how you are in your body, as a male person, and what you expect a woman or a child in their bodies to be as people in your household. Not in your household, in the household you live in. I implied that it was their household rather than a joint household. But actually that's their perspective, it is their household. and they get to set the rules. But they're all unwritten rules. And so women and children are constantly kind of bumping up against these unwritten rules that come into play once they kind of transgress over whatever line it is that...
So this methodology is really relevant to debates in the sector, and I know that we've touched on this in some other chats that we've had. And here, what you're describing is a way of measuring violence, which is different from the conflict tactics scale, for example.
Yes.
Do you want to comment a bit about that in terms of...
I think what we tried to do was to look at multiple ways in which control functions in relationships. So that's different from conflict. We're beginning from the position that if you're living in a what Anne Morris calls an abusive household gender regime, actually there's a whole set of controls about what is male privilege and entitlement and that you should respect, and what is the appropriate way that you should behave as a woman or a child in that household. And so our measures are built out of that knowledge and out of the, I would say, the knowledge that we've generated over the past 30, 40 years. So we've got multiple examples. So, for example, feeling afraid how the man would react if she gets a new partner, if they're separated, or trying to restrict where she goes, prescribing or criticising the way she does the housework, trying to look at her messages or her contacts on her phone. So that what we've done is draw on the experiential knowledge we have about how violence functions in that micromanagement way to create our measures.
Which isn't necessarily captured when you're just measuring a behaviour without understanding the context within which it's occurring.
And that's for our survey. In our in-depth interviews that we did with women and men, we got them to talk us through an example of each of our measures. And about that example, we would then say, so how are you feeling? What did you say next? So to kind of get into, in a way, in a similar way that the behaviour change programmes get men to kind of unpick in quite fine detail exactly what was going on, so that they can see the point at which they actually choose to be violent. That it's not an automatic response. That actually there's a whole process that happens. So we were trying to use that way of thinking to get closer to an actual example.
I think, Liz, the fact that you're doing quantitative and qualitative data collection is what really makes this stand out as something that grounds the research in the everyday realities, and it also makes it more readable and understandable in terms of what it means. It's also quite time consuming, as I understand, and therefore expensive, resource intensive.
Yeah, very. And it was very difficult to recruit the sample, difficult to hold on to them, because people's lives are really complicated. But one of the things I've taken away from it is that there's an orthodoxy that men are unreliable witnesses. And it really surprised us that actually more of the men at time 2 were likely to report that they had been aggressive, there had been some ways in which they had failed to stop abuse than the women. So part of what we think programmes do is enable men to be more honest about their own behaviour and enable them to speak about it in a way that isn't. I counted the number of justs that were in the men's accounts at time 1, and there's only 60 something of them, and there was something like 1,230 justs in their accounts.
Minimisation and avoidance of responsibility.
But actually you don't get that at time 2, and to me that's an important achievement, that actually they have a language to talk about abuse. They recognise that it is not just about incidents of physical assault. Some incredible quotes of men saying, it's how I stand over her, it's the tone of my voice, it's and then quotes from women saying how important that is to them and their children, that they understand that it doesn't have to be an assault, to be threatening, to be controlling.
And I think that's, again, I talk to men who are genuinely bewildered that behaviour constitutes, and it becomes such a reflex response to the demands or the stress. And now having definitions around that is, very control. I can see the impact of it. I guess gives language, gives words to those behaviours that are, just almost automatic. And I guess that sort of, some researchers are really saying that now it's the choice not to use it. It's almost sort of reflex, and now they've really got to choose, with the help of support of the programs, to not use, and that's where the choice can really sort of sit in line.
I think there's a really helpful, my colleague Maddie Coy uses a lot of embodiment theories in her work around women, young women who get involved in prostitution. And she has this idea of the habit body, and that you come to inhabit your body in a way that enables you to deal with that. I think men come to inhabit their body as a reactive instrument through which to control others and to exercise power. And I see the exercises that some programs give them, so time out, and it's kind of interrupting that habitual response. They're still choosing, but they allow that habit to be how they respond. And you're interrupting that and making them be reflective and making them do their own emotion work. I think one of the things about privilege, and in this case we're talking about gender privilege, is that you don't have to be reflexive about your own emotions. You can just, project them, throw it out there, and those strategies demand that they not do that. And so at that point, then they have a choice about whether they engage with what's going on and make sense of it. And I think some men change in a kind of mechanical way, but they still change. And others change in a much more profound way, because they actually start to pay attention to their own emotions and to their own unarticulated thoughts. And they become quite interesting, I think, as able to articulate why it was acceptable to do that before and it's not acceptable to them to do it now. And we had 3 very interesting men who were kind of one-person crime waves in their home and outside the home, constantly getting into fights with other men, and actually they said that they had stopped being violent, full stop.
Liz, that's actually something I've noticed in the program I've been involved with, and also that other people doing the work have noticed. When you actually start talking about taking responsibility and questions of choice and regulation of emotions and so on, they automatically see the connection. And sometimes they're actually not with their partner at the time. So the only place they can practice the sorts of things we're talking about is in their workplaces or on the street. So I think for the men who are generally violent or who are involved in criminal activity broadly, it's actually, it actually seems to be part of what we're doing, that we are addressing this big picture issue of their violence, not just the violence at home, not that it's in any way minimising the importance of that.
I mean, in our sample, there's only 3 who would be in that category. I think most of the others, I don't think they're particularly. I think they're probably some. We had more who recognised that they were dismissive and distanced at work, and that this enabled them to actually be more engaged with their colleagues. And but we only had 3 who I think had a kind of huge history of violence, and actually started to feel better about themselves and have more of a sense of life having positive things in it rather than just being enraged all the time and unhappy. So I thought that's interesting that it can offer that.
Well, because
wide
absolutely have to have the, them buying in somewhere. They've got to, because of course change being a dynamic process. If you're really just trying to get to an end goal and have the pressure come off, then you just revert to most comfortable shape and so on. And I guess that really asks the question: how, what in your opinion is that sort of buy? How do you get men engaged? Is there the content, or is it the person in front of them, or the question?
I think it depends. I think it really depends. Clearly, some of the men here, most of them have been referred through children's services. So there's an issue about their access to and relationship with their children. Most of them are not making a choice themselves with no external pressure to come to the programme. Some of them were clearly incredibly instrumental. But as I say, about their engagement, yes, it was all about that they were. It was about getting contact with the child.
And as my experience is, that's how men often come into the program. But a good program that connects with their own lived experience will actually start to make sense of them, and they may find other motivation down the track. How much of that did you see?
They may do, but they may not.
Yeah.
On a purely does this work level, if they change instrumentally but nonetheless change, they've changed and they're doing less harm in the lives of those women and children. I think the fundamental change, where it's not just about the physical and sexual violence but also about all these other measures which we didn't find so much success. Everything changed in the right direction, but the control, the blaming the woman was much more difficult, it seemed, to. So that what you've got there is only some of the men choose to go that step, and a challenge to programmes is to find better ways to enable them to go that step. But again, that's an issue about. You're often funded just to stop the physical violence.
Yeah.
There's not an investment in actually to change women and children's lives so that this is a relationship that can grow and change into a shared future. You need more than that. And that's always been our concern, that actually you can stop the physical and sexual violence, but they're still walking on eggshells. They still can't have that ordinary argument.
Yeah, that's space for action.
Yeah.
So Liz, that relates to the resourcing of these programs, the extent to which the investment maybe? Have you got some thoughts in regard to
Actually, can I just make a comment about that? Because as I understand the way our contracts work in Queensland, there isn't that much specificity about we're just stopping physical violence. And look, in the conversations we've had within the Speak Network over the years, I think all of the people involved in these programs are aware that that's an essential part of it, but it's absolutely all the other stuff that has to be addressed as well. And addressing all the other stuff provides a platform in which physical and sexual violence can't take place. It just doesn't make sense if you're addressing these questions of control and power and taking responsibility and so on. So I'm not sure that funding is the limitation. Where funding limits us is the fact that we, for example, standards, practice standards in Queensland are a minimum 32-hour program. There is 1 or 2 programs that run longer than that. But that's one of the biggest limitations. And so I noticed in the UK respect standards, they don't set a specific quantum, but they do say we would see how could you meet the standards in less than 60 hours. So there's a quasi sort of level of 60 hours. That whole question of standards, which then obviously has some bearing on what resourcing the government is going to be putting into it, seems to be a really crucial part of the kind of results that you've seen. You're working with programs that were all accredited to respect standards. Can you say something about that and the sorts of things you saw were critical in that process?
The whole point of the project was that we would be looking at the best practice, but also a shared set of standards across a number of organisations, that they were all working to the same principles and the same. And it was really Respect who wanted this piece of work to be done. And they selected us out of a competitive process to be the ones to develop the methodology and to get the funding to do the project. But once we got the funding, we were then, Respect were part of the advisory group, but it was our independent research, not.
Yeah.
I think there is a wish for outcomes, and the basic outcome is always ending physical violence. So although you're not necessarily funded directly around that,
right,
that's the outcome measure, the basic outcome measure that commissioners are looking for.
Right.
And that's my issue, that actually you could achieve that, but not fundamentally change the conditions in which women and children are living.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that question of outcome measures is really important. We actually don't have outcomes reporting yet. There is a national project looking at outcome standards, which, as I understand, at the moment is currently stalled. It's to a certain level. It seems to me that actually to measure it in a way that's meaningful in the lives of women and children is actually really difficult. Any comments about that one? Like, how can that be operationalised in a way that the governments can actually?
Well, I think one of the things that we would say is that we think that our measures of success, particularly when you get down to the more detailed things that we asked about, they can actually feed into that framework.
Okay.
Because we're trying to see the extent of difference that it makes in the lives of women and children, and we only had we had a PhD attached where we actually did interview, well, Sue Alderson interviewed some children as well. That was very difficult to do, and one of the real challenges we think is that most behaviour change programmes don't have attached children's workers. They don't provide support for children about what the process means for them. If they do work with children and young people, it's in a wider preventative in schools, and actually that those children deserve some kind of input as well, and some kind of voice as well in what they think the process is meaning for them. And Sue developed a really clever workbook for working with children. So we've kind of laid a basis, if you like, I think, for people to pick up and play with and work with some of this background methodological work, and take it forward in a practice context. And we're really happy to share all of our instruments and everything. They're going to go up on the website in Durham, and people can just use them however they want to.
Yep. Wonderful.
Oh, terrific. Yeah.
Can I just step in there? Following up this discussion about the specific programs that you're referring to, and this specific set that was evaluated here, Liz. But I'm conscious that there are very well-meaning individuals and organisations struggling to provide some kind of response for perpetrators in communities, often with little training or resources. So have you got any comment in regard to that in the UK, Liz? I mean, this was a particular range of perpetrator programs under the Respect banner, but there would be others that are not necessarily following the same, practice methodology and.
Yes, there are others who don't follow, and then there's also a whole big group within the criminal justice system. None of the men here are mandated from the criminal justice. That's been run by our probation service, and they have had a programme that has many similarities to the one that the Respect groups use, but that is increasingly being abandoned as being too gendered, and they are adopting this building better relationships that is a strengths-based and a positive affirmation-based programme rather than the challenge of the men's behaviour change perpetrator work. And I see that in two ways. One is probation is increasingly being privatised in the UK, and the probation service is going to only hold on to the most dangerous offenders. So some domestic violence perpetrators will be in that group, but most of them, because what they're convicted of are quite low-level offences, will not be in that group, and they are then going to be managed by private enterprises on payment by results. So actually having this one-size-fits-all programme fits with that privatisation agenda. I also think it's really I think it's hard work being a facilitator with these programmes, and it's hard work in that I think you have to do a double thing. You have to make a human connection with the men. They have to think that you actually have an investment in them changing, and that you don't think they're totally awful and horrible human being, at the same time as being very challenging in a very minute kind of taking apart particular events in their lives. And that's not an easy thing to do. And I think it's not just about training. Training is important, but I actually think you have to have a motivation and an interest in finding ways to do those things simultaneously.
Well, I think ultimately, from what I believe, is that you've probably have to have journeyed a little bit yourself. You know, you have had to probably address changes in yourself that are absolutely related to past beliefs or and that really the most effective people I've been around are those that are in that process of self-discovery. And that I know, working in corrections and used to come into very resistant groups, all sort of sitting with this posture, it was to find that place, that point of engagement, and yet hold a certain line that really said, you know, I'm just inviting you to come to this, and from here we can begin the discussion. But you're right, it you know, there's a part that wears at you, and the group, of course, is a consensus of, you know, it can either be discord or, and of course the best thing is to get them tipping that the pro-social way. But you know, every sort of hour of that is a sort of a negotiative struggle balance. You know, so I think it's really important that we set really high standards for that, and we constantly chat to David Adams from Boston, the Emerge program, and love his analysis and love his capacity to hold that, you know, really highest. It's an important thing that he, as a doctor, will still be standing in front of those men saying it's that important. You know, this is that important work, that I hold this level of sort of qualifications and degree, but I need to be here to help to encourage you and to, you know. But it's you know, it's an interesting thing. Do you think that you know, that, I mean, it's an interactive process, isn't it? The whole thing sort of interacts, and even the women in the men's life also have, as I picked up, the sort of empowerment to change too. Just some thoughts and comments about that. I could read that into that really, at certain points in women's lives, they feel, you know, I'll start to push a little back or grab some space back. Can be dangerous, but meaning, you know, can result in further abuses. But I'd suggest necessary in resetting the bar, and in particular if it's an ongoing relationship. Yeah,
and I think that dangerousness risk is kind of, but that's what they've been living with for however long it is, and if they've got to the point where they're going, I'm pushing back now, that's enough. I think we need to support them in doing that, rather than in the same way that I think some of the advice to children that they should never intervene, they should never. It's unrealistic. You know, if they're hearing something and they think something terrible is happening to their mother, not doing something is a terrible thing to live with. When actually, if you feel like you run downstairs and interrupt it, then and yes, there's a danger there, but it's like we imagine that we can create a household where domestic violence is happening, where it's not dangerous. I mean, by definition, it's dangerous. And I kind of put myself in that situation. I think if I was a child and I heard that, I would need to go down and try and interrupt it, or check if it goes silent. Has your mum been killed? I mean, you know, it's kind of. So I think we're really unrealistic at times about. We don't put ourselves in that situation. We think about it in an abstract way. And the really interesting thing, and we need to do some more work on this because we've not teased it out, but there are some women for whom just the man being on the programme, he doesn't have to change that much. Just the fact that someone else is keeping him under surveillance, is saying that his behaviour is a problem, enables them to push back and create more space for themselves. But then there's another group of women who the men change quite a lot, but they're scared to test it. They're scared to push into the more space that's there. And I hadn't expected to find that. I've not seen that before. And I think that's a really interesting challenge to the women's support services.
I think I picked that up in this measure here, where you asked about how they felt. You know, the movement was whereas these are all sort of behaviours, observable things, whereas you really ask them, so do you feel better? And they're like, well, I'm still sort of, still a debate 12 months later. And I think that's the hard yard.
So there's, and that's a link to another project, a different project that we finished in the summer last year, where we followed 100 women for 3 years after they exited services. And we made a distinction there between being and feeling safe. And you can actually be safe or
Yeah,
considerably safer, but still not feel it. And we haven't really made those distinctions before.
But you were talking earlier about the living in the body and the habit that one assumes as a perpetrator, and I'm wondering and listening to you about the habit that women start to live in when they live with the violence, and so the sort of automatic response, that's almost despite herself, to a change in the context, and what that might mean for her in terms of...
I think you're absolutely right, and I think what happens for them is anticipating doing something differently evokes a fear response, because that's what it's been, and I think that's a challenge, I think, for the women's support services, that there's been almost a presumption that creating more safety automatically leads to more freedom, and what these women exemplify is not for everybody, and that actually you need to be checking on that, you need to be working with it, rather than just assuming that the two follow each other automatically.
Do you think, just coming back to the correctional shift, in terms of its theory and methodology and practice with the men's behaviour change programs, I suppose it's a question mark whether it's actually men's behaviour change now?
No, I don't think it is.
No, so it's behaviour change, maybe.
No,
maybe not.
it's
Relationship shift.
Well, the acronym using in the report is Domestic Violence Prevention Program, and what we're calling them in Queensland is Intervention Program. It's difficult finding the language, isn't it? The unique thing about these programs compared to other programs in domestic violence field is that they are working with the men who are perpetrating the violence. But they're not just working with that, so we need a term that is more all-encompassing than just...
What I was getting at was...
You were talking about the
shift
corrections.
in thinking, that if your theory is underpinned by the conflict tactic scale as an example, which, about which there is absolutely wide, degree of, contested domain and controversy, nevertheless, it is a powerful tool, and if any organisation takes from those measures that violence is more equal between partners in the absence of a gendered analysis, then you are justified in doing a relationships course as opposed to a violence against women course. So I'm just wondering whether the shift in thinking or what it is that's underpinned that shift in corrections too.
It's partly that. It's partly wanting a one-size-fits-all for all offenders, and that there's a kind of underlying psychological theory that they are antisocial or asocial human beings, and therefore you need to build better relationships, make them more social. So it's and I still think it's partly that the demands on facilitators of doing this kind of work well are really big, and they just want a kind of module-based course that can be delivered by part-time sessional people, paid not very much money, but everybody gets the same thing, and so it's actually about that whole thing of moving away from specialism, moving away from the need to really be immersed in an issue and an understanding in order to deliver good work. That actually anybody can do it because we just give them the manual and you just press go and go.
I'm so pleased to hear you talking about that, Liz, and your earlier comments about what's involved in doing the work and the need for the appropriate personal qualities as well as the intellectual or the academic qualifications. We're in the process in Queensland of looking at how we might get training established, so it's sort of part of the thinking that's going around here. I was thinking, just jumping back earlier to your comments about the nature of the work, that what makes it work is that there's a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Relationships take time, but it takes skill to build a relationship in the context of one holding a really clear and strong position on the violence is not okay, and that we have a bigger perspective about the equality of men and women. And doing that in a way that doesn't involve an experience of judgment or shaming rather, they do experience shame but not shaming. The feedback we get in our program consistently is how important, like when they say what was valuable, it's the non-judgmental experience. So yeah, that actually takes real personal, having done some personal journey and some personal qualities, not just the intellectual. So great to hear the validation of the importance of specialisation and being immersed in the field.
I think also what some of our men said is that they never ever have this space. They never have a space in which they allow themselves to feel vulnerable, in which they have searching, deep, profound conversations with other men, and in which they learn to accept a challenge or a very difficult question without that creating a need to be aggressive. And so I think there's spaces, you are creating spaces which are challenging them to be men differently, and they have to be men differently in those spaces. And then the question is, how far do they then take it from there?
Will it go out the door with them?
But they can have an experience of it being okay, to be doing things that don't fit the prescribed gender norms, to be talking with men and doing, accepting challenge in ways that don't fit those norms, and it's okay, and it's not, maybe not even just okay, but good.
Well, you can almost feel a palpable relief when men start to break down some of those masculinity stereotypes and start to realise, I'm actually terrified about trying to provide and be the stoic, have no emotion, no feeling. And as there's that collaborative sharing, that's those moments in those groups are great. You can feel that sort of that sense of really, you feel that too. As is suggested, there's a lot of tension and fear and shame in trying to maintain this constructed version, I guess, of masculinity, and it being terrifying.
And emotionless.
And emotionless, that
and
expectation.
And so emotions are then terrifying because they're emotions other than anger.
Other than anger. Absolutely. Anger is very good at covering all the ones that you don't want to feel, that are too scary to feel.
Yeah. And those that all then get projected onto the women and the children.
Exactly, and that experience of projection, because it's the women who end up then carrying the fear, experiencing it.
I love it. When I talk to our guys, really when someone's phoning in to the men's line, you're often just helping them organise their feelings. So they're really, is that what I'm feeling? It's really just putting them, I use this sort of, but it's really just putting them in a manner that they're organised and I can sort of access and reach them and understand them. Just explain a little bit more about that one. And again, you just get a sense that, yes, boy, if you've just grown up, creating your own version of masculinity, it's fairly shallow, it's fairly, and it's fragile.
Yeah.
And given a couple of knocks, it can fall right over. And then that compensatory response is, wow, I'll reassert that sort of, look, this is it, and those
back to safe territory for them.
The wonderful thing about the study are the results, and you talked a little bit, Liz, about your surprise in terms of the experience with the men in the study. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? The kind of tendency to, as you call it, monsterise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've thought about this a lot, actually. I didn't actually do the interviews with the men. The research staff in our teams did. But it was very interesting in the beginning how anxious all four of them were about interviewing men. 3 very different women and 1 man. And I remember talking to them and saying, "Oh, I felt a bit like that when we did," but actually they're ordinary. They're really, and you're going to be interviewing them in a context. We interviewed them whilst they were attending for a session, so we're interviewing them in the most contained space in their life. So I think there was a kind of, and it's become clearer and clearer to me that, and I don't put myself outside of this, that as soon as we say perpetrator, they become a scary man, as opposed to before they had that designation, one of the guys in our family, somebody who you sat next to on the tube, somebody who you go to the same bar as, somebody who's a work colleague, who has a name, and you've actually passed pleasantries with or had conversations with, but as soon as they have that perpetrator label, they become dangerous and someone who you don't want to engage with. And I see it so much in social workers, in our students on our MA, that the idea of engaging with a perpetrator is terrifying. And so I do think there's a way in which, unintentionally, I don't think it was an intentional to monsterise, but that perpetrator word monsterises, and then workers who should be drawing boundaries and actually giving messages about unacceptability become terrified of doing it because it's the perpetrator. It's not Mark, it's not Thomas.
Or equally, Liz, I think it can lock people into a one-dimensional picture of what that man is.
Yes.
I think I'm really pleased that you've highlighted here and in other forums the importance of language again, because in lots of areas we are careful about language, but somehow there's something about maybe the seriousness of the issue that people want to use the perpetrator word. And I know it's an abbreviation, it's kind of quick and easy, but there are real dangers if we use it uncritically, where really what we're talking about is a man who has perpetrated domestic violence.
Yeah, and that's why you have men's behaviour change.
Yeah.
I hadn't seen it in that so clearly before, but I absolutely get that now.
I know the sector in Victoria is very, very clear about that in all their dialogue. That's how they talk. I think in Queensland we've been a little less clear about that.
And in the legal context, it's respondent and aggrieved, isn't it?
That's right.
So there are, and arguably that's a little bit more neutral, actually, because respondent denotes, well, it's not decided yet, actually. It's someone who's had to respond. Yeah.
I think when we come into actually working with men who've perpetrated abuse with that idea that he's a man who's perpetrated abuse, implicitly it means that he can also do other things. Yeah. And there's more to him. Quite often there's aspirations not to be violent. And so using that language just, I think, helps us keep the door open, keeps the thinking more open about how we can work with that man and what he's capable of.
And it's... on the other hand, you kind of need workers to name the abuse as well, because that then gives them a responsibility to act or to say something. But one of the really interesting things that's happening in one of our men's programmes in the UK is that they have a co-location project where one of their workers sits in the child protection team.
Uh-huh.
And part of the intention of what that will do is to enable the child protection social workers to have the man in their sights, not just the woman and the children. And that they should be doing some engagement with him. And they are so frightened of doing it. But doing co-work and co-visits with the workers from the men's programme, actually they're modelling how to do it, and they're showing that actually, you know, it's no more likely that something terrible will happen than if you're dealing with mental health. There'll be one case in however many where something really tough happens for a social worker working in mental health. Same in domestic violence. But somehow that perpetrator designation actually creates a huge barrier to actually engaging with the men, and that's part of why they become the invisible men in child protection work, and we need to make them visible and make them accountable through that, not just, you know, I think men's programmes, we need them, they're part of the process. We also need all workers to be having the men in their frame of reference and enabled to actually give them really clear messages that this is not okay, this is not acceptable. You need to stop this. And here's one possibility, but that needs to be a constant message, I think.
But even those concepts of, you know, collusion and accountability and challenging in the use of effective language is more about just, you know, laying in front of the perpetrator or the man using violence, you know, the fact that it just doesn't sit true, it doesn't sit right, that really quite often people going to talk to perpetrators have this thought that, you know, I have to be sort of combative, I have to sort of meet them at a certain point, and if I miss that point, you know, then all bad things can happen. But really, if you hold, I believe, I encourage our guys to hold a version of accountability, which is talking to the man to rise above what's going on. Think of it in a different way, and lay that challenge really in just the fact that that just doesn't sit true for me, you know, and I'm having trouble sort of, you know, certainly not backing away from engaging, but shifting away from that sense, that tense sense that I've got to meet them at every point and sort of combat them at every moment. And I think that again empowers people, again, not specialised but necessary to have that language of accountability, skilled up to be able to fight to catch those key moments. Because I know, talking to child protection workers, in the whole thing there's these key moments. There's moments of silence or moments of calm where, you know, if I had the right seed to plant at this particular moment or the right word to put into the framework, it, you know, may begin that process of effective sort of intervention. Whereas if we sense that we've got to be sort of skilled and have everything, we're frozen more than anything.
Frozen, and what then happens is that the focus then shifts to the woman,
You did right.
and she then gets made responsible for the safety of the children and for his behaviour, because the workers are frozen in relation to him, and so it's actually a really problematic in that it does not hold him to account, and because they've not done that, they then focus on making the woman be held to account.
Yes, because it's easier.
Yes.
And I guess that raises a capacity issue, you know, in terms of having the appropriate people to support child safety practice in that way. Whereas I think to date it's often thought that domestic violence services would play that role in the interface with child safety. But in fact, as you say, it's really important that the men's behaviour change sector is represented in there somehow, but it does raise capacity issues.
I think the good news is that we get men in through the door and bums in seats, and change, whether it's instrumental or sort of reflective, begins to occur. And if we're realistic of the fact that we're all part of a process, we're not idealistic that this one intervention is going to change, but really, again, collaborating and really working towards a sort of end goal.
But just picking up on that though, Mark, because nevertheless, in terms of the evaluation of men's behaviour change programs internationally, the results are quite equivocal. This is why I thought this was really, these are strong results from this particular model, whereas others, looking at this from perhaps an investor's perspective, a government perspective about, well, what do we choose to invest in? What's the best, outcome for the investment? And there are, as I say, these equivocal results, and those programs appear to more commonly combine CBT with some gender analysis.
I think it's partly that, but I also think it's partly a very mechanistic way of thinking about change and the results. So if you're going to drop someone out when there's the first violence or abuse whilst they're on the programme, they become a failure. You're not going to get very good results because actually this is, I would not expect most men to not have some behaviours that are problematic, certainly while they're on the course, and for some of them afterwards. It's totally unrealistic. So the measurement of change, that's why we called it steps towards change. That we're not talking about totally transformed men. That maybe there's one or two in there, but actually, the more steps they take, the more different the lives of the women and children are. And the measure being an absolute one, you're not going to see. You're really not going to see that much. Whereas I just don't think that's realistic. We don't measure other programmes in that way.
So there's quite a fundamental challenge to the way in which a plethora of mandated programs are currently constructed and measured. It does really does challenge the many models that are in operation.
I'm really pleased to hear you raise that. I think,
which is great.
Yeah. In this work, I guess, because we know there's so much at stake, there can be a tendency to want to be seen to be kind of loyal to the cause. And if you're doing things that people might perceive as being less than full throttle, less than full strength in some way, that somehow that's...
You're letting them off?
Yeah, you're letting them off to be frowned on and so on. That particular question of, for example, if a man is in any way violent, he has to leave the program. And that wasn't all you were talking. You were actually talking
but
about
he falls out of the evaluation.
Falls out of the evaluation, yeah.
As a potential success.
Right. Yeah. Whereas what we do know about change is that there are lapses, and in the context of a program, what happens during those lapses is different to what might have happened previously, because there's a whole context that's supporting reflection and going back and looking at it and analysing it, and different things happen, and it's messy, and it is a painful reality that what that actually means is that the woman is still experiencing violence, but she was anyway. So what we're actually doing is working towards minimising.
It's resource intensive, but of course it is that opportunity to really have grounded conversation on the lead up to what was happening. Have a real analysis, and it's like working with people who are attempting to stop using substances. And that lead up towards the relapse is all this discussion. What was happening for you, thinking wise, feeling wise? So I see what you mean, that the value of working around or working with, particularly if they've come back in, they're compliant,
Yeah.
they want to understand what just happened to for me.
Yeah.
You know, is valuable. But again, when we, I guess it was our earlier discussion about costs and measures, and you know, we've got to be so careful not to be just seduced into that fact that we've got to, you know, hold these, you know, sort of, got to have this cost and benefits analysis going on all the time. But really, this is an incremental process towards change, various steps involved. Yeah.
What about that criticism which is sometimes levelled at men's behaviour change programs over, for example, Robertson's New Zealand evaluation, which found that some men appeared to learn to actually act out the behaviours more cleverly than previously?
We didn't find much evidence for that. We did have evidence that some men continued practices that they had already been using, and they didn't change those. But we didn't see that much evidence of a shift in the practices, which you would expect.
Yes,
If they're learning from the programme how to be smarter abusers, you'd see a change in the tactics that they're using. And we actually didn't see that much. We had a couple of women who talked about, yes, they had changed, but they were a bit more manipulative now. But that's it, in terms of the in-depth interview data. So I think this idea that perpetrator programs just produce cleverer abusers, that's not what our data says.
And actually, a lot of what you've reported in that report, Liz, is very affirming for what I've seen on the ground in my work in this field over the last 10 years. And a lot of, you know, the outcomes and so on, it feels very familiar reading through what's in there. So that's been very affirming. I had a couple of questions that on the website. I don't know how much more time we've got.
No, go. We should, let's
Shortly.
go with those and perhaps
All right.
start with
There are a couple of questions I didn't see explored in the report, and maybe they're explored elsewhere. And one of them is exploring and accounting for change in men who didn't complete or attend programs.
We didn't get a big enough sample.
Right.
We recruited much less into the study than we had hoped to. So our sample isn't big enough to do that analysis.
Okay.
You need a significant group
Right.
and we don't have a big enough group to
Okay.
do that,
All right.
I'm afraid.
Yep. And also comments about what helps men to engage and remain engaged. And I might have missed it in the report, but the engagement question is a really important one.
Yeah, we need to do some more work on this data, and also when Ruth Phillips completes her PhD on programme integrity, because she's the one who's interviewed the facilitators and about some of those things. But she needs to finish her PhD first before we can move into that. But she is very definitely exploring the idea of integrity as a process and not about adherence to models. That it's about, integrity is about a process within a service. And one of the really interesting things that she's thinking about at the moment is integrity is always thought about just in terms of the group work with men. But what's integrity in relation to the Women's Support Service, in relation to work with children, in relation to the wider advocacy work? So we should be thinking about integrity in terms of a service, not just in terms of one part of the provision. So I think we can get to that when she's written up.
Right.
And she's in process of writing up now.
Okay.
But I really don't want, it's her PhD and she needs to have that first.
Sure.
I can immediately see, this harks back to the measurement challenge you know, for administrators, governments, etc. You know, because by the sounds of it, Liz, it's talking about the much more holistic appreciation of the whole case, rather than the one specific intervention, which is, you know, to date, we tend to focus and measure just that one intervention and not that whole.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we have time to talk briefly about risk assessment.
Yes, do. Yes, it's really important.
And
It's really important.
we were having this conversation a little bit earlier, and in recent years, risk assessment's really become quite a prominent feature of what we do, and you had some concerns about the direction that was being taken in some areas.
Yes, I think it's it's a much narrower concept, risk, than the safety and freedom that we've been talking about here. And that's my frustration with it, that I think it narrows and flattens what our concerns are, what's in our vision. And it also suggests that somehow you can reduce risk and it stays reduced. And that's not the experience of many of the women and children I've spent time with, nor of some of the research literature. And actually, we all know, for example, that separation increases risks of certain kind of violence and abuse. But actually, that's the step that is required and encouraged by certainly children's services in order to make children safer. So we're kind of in this almost Alice in Wonderland place where actually things that we know get turned around and upside down. But I think the risk assessment takes us into this over-focus on physical assault, criminalised behaviours, and away from the coercive control, the everyday life context of women and children who are living in one of these households. And that's not considered risk or risky, but that is what women and children talk about afterwards as being the hardest to come to terms with and to move on from. That being made to feel inferior, being denied a voice, being controlled in all sorts of ways is actually much more difficult to unpick and see how it's affected you than a physical or a sexual assault.
So would a measure of the level of the male's dangerousness be a more realistic? Wouldn't, I mean, although that would be dynamic, there'd be aspects of that would be static and...
Dangerous in what way?
Yeah,
and danger in what way? Because again, I think we end up I'm not saying you don't need to do that, and I think you need to do some assessment of the men and their readiness to take part, and but all of this stuff about risk or dangerous or whatever, it's all about, ultimately it's about saying there are certain parts of your behaviour that we consider more important than others, and that importance is not necessarily the experiential one of the women and children living in, and that's my unease, that it takes us away from what it's like to live in this household. That they're walking on eggshells again, and that won't feature in risk or in dangerousness, but that's as it's lived. That's what it feels like. So our measures are always measures are always an abstraction, and they're always less complex than lived experience. I accept that, but I feel like risk assessment has just taken us so far away, and that the safety planning, for example, that used to be part of the work of women's organisations, was much more a collaborative exploration with someone about their particular relationship and the particular man who they were involved with and the ways that he might control. Whereas risk assessment, it's is all of this part of what's going on in your situation? Well, there might be control is always specific to a person, isn't it? And you know what their vulnerabilities are, what their anxieties are, what their and so you're using specifics that will never appear on one of those lists.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas if you're doing safety planning and exploring about your particular relationship, your situation, those things can appear.
So in other words, a preoccupation with objective or so-called
Yes.
objective risk
Yes.
ignores subjective risk, which is context dependent.
Yes.
And cannot be measured possibly
Absolutely.
by a so-called objective tool. Yeah.
Yes.
It's just, I'm just mindful here of the unintended consequences too of some of the risk measures, and this harks back to your child safety discussion, where for some time in some countries in the risk estimation system that was used to assess child safety risk, there was a clause of the failure to protect.
Yes.
So this comes back to the accountability that's held to the woman, because, and the cynical may argue that that's the easier road, because she's the one who's there, with the children, and the perpetrator is noticeably absent. The person who's doing the violence is noticeably absent, and then the unintended consequences is that then all the measures, the control measures, are targeted towards the woman who is the subject of this.
Yep.
Yeah.
And some of the risk assessment, so we have these workers called independent domestic violence advisors or advocates, depending on, and they are linked to our multi-agency risk assessment conferences, and they have a very standard risk assessment measure. And once you've reduced it by a certain amount, then you pull out because your engagement is to do that.
Deemed to be.
And I have spoken to a number of women who manage the projects, and the woman's mental health isn't there as a risk. It's all the physical violence. So some of them secretly carry on working with women, even though they're not supposed to in terms of their standards,
the measures,
because she's suicidal.
Yes, it's, yeah.
And to them, that is an incredible risk to her safety.
Yes.
But it doesn't feature in terms of the risk assessment
So
framework.
So it sounds like, Liz, those concerns have come out of the way risk assessment's been operationalised within the MARACs. I'm thinking about how people talk about and do risk assessment here, and my thinking about it is it's always been an ongoing process. You do initial risk assessment, but you don't stop assessing risk, and that it's a dynamic thing. So the concept of someone pulling out once you've reduced it sounds nuts to me. It's so. I'm thinking, as we're in the process of, there are all sorts of changes in the system in terms of contracts for new services and so on. That means the development of integrated responses is being highlighted more and more. And as we develop those, I guess it's useful to keep in mind that how we do risk assessment is actually really important. That we don't do this thing of treating it as a static thing you can reduce and walk away from, that it is dynamic.
The whole
and it needs
purpose
to be constantly engaged.
of MARAC is to do that.
Right.
The whole purpose of MARAC is short-term risk reduction,
Oh, okay.
and that you kind of have this rolling number of cases that you're dealing with,
Ah, okay.
and that actually cases shouldn't really come back to MARAC.
Oh, right.
What you should do is work around the table to how we're going to reduce the risk. You reduce the risk, then they're not a MARAC case anymore.
I see. I see.
So it's a model that's been picked up because it's seen to produce quick turnaround of results. But nobody's following up where women are afterwards. And actually they're probably linked into some other service because actually, as you say, it's dynamic. And I much prefer holistic services that enable women and children to access what they need when they need to access it, rather than some kind of external assessment of you don't need services anymore.
Criteria for me.
Yeah. And it should be needs-based rather than risk-based.
That sounds
Good. Good. to
sounds
keep in
like a
mind.
really
Sounds
might
good
be a
vision.
really good spot to start to.
Julie's been talking about about 2 hours.
Yes, I think it might be a really
You're gonna have to
I think-
edit this.
I think it's a
Well,
really good
it's
time to finish. That's a nice note to finish on though. It comes back to that holistic reference that was made earlier, and the needs-based approach, coming back to the needs of women and children, and having services driven by that, is a priority. Well, thank you everybody. That's been really very
Fabulous.
interesting.
Got a lot to
It's quite
digest
a
and a lot to
marathon.
integrate into new bits and pieces.